Well, hello there. Thank you for watching this video. It's part of a series on women and passages that personally have bothered me, and so I did some research, and I'm just here to share with you what I've learned. You may not find this interesting, and that's okay. If you are interested, even if you disagree, I hope you feel that this was a benefit to you in thinking on this subject. Always feel free to comment below or contact me. And we're going to start with this one because it's actually a really good example of why doing homework and close studies on passages that are bothersome is a really rich and fruitful thing to do. And so I hope that this video alone is a good example of why when we're bothered by a text, instead of running away from it, I think we should study it and see whatever we can learn. So without further ado, I'm going to use Matthew 15, but there's a parallel story of the Syrophoenician woman in Mark chapter 7. But I'm going to start with Matthew 15 and go from there. So I'm going to read it to you here. In 15 verse 21 it says, "And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, 'Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon.' But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, 'Send her away, for she is crying out after us.' And he answered, 'I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.' But she came and knelt before him, saying, 'Lord, help me.' And he answered, 'It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs.' She said, 'Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table.' Then Jesus answered her, 'O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire.' And her daughter was healed instantly." Okay, so I don't know about you, but for me, growing up, this story always caused a sort of a what the heck kind of response from me. And so you may be able to relate to that or not. Why does Jesus call this lady a dog? Is it because she's a lady? Is it because she's a Canaanite? Like, honestly, what's happening here? And so what we're going to do is we're going to, I'm going to focus in on two things. I'm going to focus on the dog insult. And I'm also going to focus on how this story helps the narratives of Matthew and Mark tell a larger story, and why I think that this story is laid out the way it is, and I think it's on purpose. So first we're going to do historical background. The historical background is because of the Seleucid Empire's long-lasting dominance over the Palestinian area, which would have been in recent memory of Jesus' generation, there is significant animosity between Jewish Israelites and Syrians. And I think that this dog reference actually has more to do with that than the fact that she's ethnically foreign. It's not about ethnicity, it's about the animosity, and we'll focus in on that in just a second. And literary context, this story is not a standalone story. In my opinion, this story in both Matthew 15 and Mark 7 plays a role in the wider context of those Gospels, which I'm going to be able to show you in just a second. So, but it's important that her ethnic identity is not something that becomes a sideline, but becomes front and center. Because when you think about it, in both stories, it is emphasized that she is Canaanite from this particular region. In Matthew chapter 15 verse 22 it says, "Behold, a Canaanite woman," and you'd think that'd be enough to show that she's foreign. No, from that region. And where is Jesus? He's in the district of Tyre and Sidon, which, by the way, in the Gospel of Matthew, this is the farthest away Jesus ever gets from Jerusalem. And so there's something significant about the setting, and it's significant that she's from that region. In Mark, in chapter 7 verse 26, we see a two-step progressive identification. Now, the woman was a Gentile, more specifically Syrophoenician by birth. Now, I don't believe that the gospel writers just add in random details just for filler. It's important that she's Syrophoenician. Now, why would that be important? It's important because the Syrians were enemies of God's people, and if Jesus is going to allow her, even her, to get a miracle by faith, then Jesus is making quite a statement here. But I'm jumping the gun here. Let's do our research first. Literary structure. In both Matthew and Mark's versions of this story, there are two miraculous feedings accounts. And you might think like, wow, that's excessive. Why are there two miraculous feeding accounts? I believe that both of these feeding accounts form inclusios, which is a fancy word for bookends, that create structure for these stories. So in both Matthew and Mark, you see the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus walking on water, arguing with the religious leaders about what defiles a person, the story of the Canaanite lady, and then Jesus miraculously feeding 4,000, and then Jesus warning of the yeast of Pharisees and Peter's confession. So these all happen together. I believe there are three clear motifs. There's bread, which is metaphorical, but also yeast, which is also metaphorical. What makes a person clean or unclean? Is it what goes into their mouth or what comes out? And faith. And they do all kind of work together. Now I want to show you the structure from, if you zoom out, and we're going to use Mark's version. Okay, let me just explain what you're looking at. This is a chiastic structure. And chiasms just basically comes from the Greek chi, which is like an X. Okay, so it's going to go in and then go back out. And the things that are parallel with each other, like A and A prime, are thematically related. And it's kind of obvious here. Jesus feeds 5,000, Jesus feeds 4,000. That's A and A prime. The thing after the 5,000 is Jesus heals people. Well, what happens before the feeding of the 4,000? Jesus heals a guy. So these are thematically related, B and B prime. Jesus argues with the Pharisees about purity laws. That would be paralleled with Syrophoenician woman's story. And in the middle is Jesus tells the disciples that all foods are clean. Now, if this is a chiasm, which I believe that as far as chiastic structure goes, this is pretty obviously a chiasm, with these inclusios on the beginning and the end, then the very thing in the middle would be important. Now, what is Jesus telling the disciples that all foods are clean for? Why is he doing that? If the significance of Peter's vision to eat unclean foods in Acts chapter 10, verse 13, was that God is calling Peter to bring the gospel to Cornelius, and by extension, Gentiles, then Jesus declaring all foods are clean could also easily be a way of communicating that the bread of life is available to all people, Jews and Gentiles alike. So Jesus telling the disciples that all foods are clean, right smack dab in the middle of this chiastic structure that begins and ends with supernatural provision from heaven, then something significant is happening in this entire structure around the motif of God providing by faith for all people. So you probably see this structure here. So I've just highlighted Jesus feeds the 5,000 and 4,000. Those are the inclusios. Then we have Jesus heals people. Jesus healing a deaf mute man. Again, these are paralleled together. And if the middle is a theme, the central theme of the section, then that means that what's left is Jesus argues with the Pharisees about purity laws being paralleled with the story of the Syrophoenician woman. To me, this makes perfect sense because Jesus is saying to them, hey, it's not what goes into your mouth that defiles you, it's what comes out. Well, what kinds of things could come out of you that defile you? And Jesus gives examples of sins. But at that same time, it begs the question, well, could something come out of you that cleanses? Is there something good that can come out of you? And the answer is obviously yes. Faith, trust, humility. So we're going to see a woman that demonstrates that. Here's the chiastic structure from Matthew. And in this version, we have the feedings of the multitudes at the beginning and end. Jesus walks on water, then heals people. The parallel to that is Jesus goes along the water and heals people. And then these two in the middle are just right next to each other. Jesus argues with the Pharisees about cleanliness in the Syrophoenician woman story. So again, they're paired together, but this time just by proximity. Now, I believe that this is important, but what we're going to do is we're going to press pause on that, and we're going to just focus in on how the word dog is used in the Old Testament, because that's probably one of the most offensive parts of this whole thing. Okay, so a lot of people believe, they just assume this, by the way, there's no evidence for it. They just believe that Israelites and Jews would use the word dog as sort of a racist insult against non-Jews. But if you really look through the Old Testament, you see the word dog as an insult used a bunch of times. And it's sometimes towards a Gentile, but it's mostly towards other Israelites. So right off the bat, it's not an insider-outsider thing. So what is it about dogs that makes a good insult? Well, Abner in 2 Samuel 2, verse 3, he refers to himself as a dog's head to Ishbosheth. In Psalm 59, verses 6 and 7, David is talking about the men that Saul sent to kill him. Each evening they come back howling like dogs and prowling about the city. bellowing with their mouths, with swords in their lips. So think about a wild dog. The imagery here is not somebody who's ethnically different, but somebody who poses some kind of a threat in the way that a wild howling dog prowling about the city would be a threat. Proverbs 26:11 refers to dogs when talking about fools in general, with no, ethnic distinctions in mind. And of course, fools can pose a threat to themselves and others by their foolishness. In Isaiah 56, we see that Israel's watchmen are described as being blind dogs with endless appetites. And so in this, those are Israelites exclusively, but they're being called dogs as an insult. It's just the base animalness of dogs is in mind here. And so far, I think it's hard to believe that the dog insult is ethnic. In fact, there's actually a pretty good argument to be made that the use of the word dog as an insult is specifically linked to things associated with literal actual dogs, and a lot of the time it's their danger. Look at this Psalm 22. David's writing, "For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me." And those first two lines are paralleled with each other, and they're expanded upon with, "They have pierced my hands and feet." So what are these dogs? Well, they're the company of evildoers. What are they doing? They're like causing literal physical harm. There are 3 times in the Old Testament where the phrase dead dog is used, and in all of those situations, the person that is referred to is a direct threat to the king of Israel himself. So for example, you see Mephibosheth referring to himself as a dead dog in 2 Samuel 9, and Shimei, the guy who curses David, is called a dead dog in 2 Samuel 16, verse 9. And so when you think about how Matthew and Mark made a big fuss over the fact that this lady is Syrian, she's Syrophoenician, Canaanite, then you remember also that the insult dog isn't ethnic, but it has a lot to do with literal actual dogs, and a lot of time because of the physical threat of violence posed by a wild dog. Then you remember, wait, the Seleucid Empire and Syrians have been traditionally enemies of God's people, and this lady is called a dog because she is a member of a hated, dangerous group to the people of God. And then you remember other things. In Matthew, except for when Jesus talks to Pontius Pilate, he basically only interacts with a couple Gentiles. The centurion who pleads with Jesus to heal his servant, and the Syrophoenician lady. And in both of those occasions, Jesus comments on their great faith. And what is Jesus and the gospel writer doing here? He's creating a foil. Even the most distant outsiders, the most unlikely people, can be included, but under this condition, faith. See, the Roman centurion represents oppressive current government, and the Syrian lady represents long-standing, entrenched hostility and hatred. But what does Jesus do? He foils their great faith with the lack of faith found among the very people you'd expect to have faith. All right, I want to do something else. I want to show you that in Matthew and Mark, they use a lot of Old Testament references directly, but sometimes they just use allusions to Old Testament stories. And I think there's an argument to be made that the Syrophoenician lady parallels really well with Hannah from 1 Samuel. Okay, let me show you why I believe that. I got Hannah here over on the left from 1 Samuel 1 and 2, and the Syrophoenician woman from Matthew 15 and Mark 7. So both women belong to lower social classes. Hannah and the Syrophoenician being women, compared to Eli and Jesus, who were religious male leaders, right? Hannah was barren, so there's a reproach there, and the Canaanite woman was repeatedly referred to as being foreign. Both women have problems related to their children. On the one hand, Hannah didn't have any and wanted one, and the Syrophoenician lady's child was demon-possessed. They were both distressed, right? And the setting was in the house of the Lord versus in the house with the Lord. And so house and Lord are key words for their physical contexts. Now, Hannah was rebuked by Eli, and the Syrophoenician lady was denied by Jesus. But they both respond politely. Hannah responds, "No, Lord." The Syrophoenician woman responds, "Yes, Lord." And they both demonstrate noble character. In fact, both women adapt and tweak the man's language that they used in the rebuff. Eli says, "Go in peace," and in Mark's version, Jesus says, "You may go." If this is a real legitimate parallel, then the main characters in the parallel, Hannah, Eli the priest, and God, collapse in the Syrian woman's story to just the Syrian woman and Jesus, which I think is actually kind of cool, because While these women have much in common, the men have a few crucial differences. Jesus was not technically wrong in his understanding of this lady. Eli was mistaken. But Jesus' rebuff was likely done on purpose as an obstacle to her to make a point. And I believe I'm going to get to that in just a second. But while Eli promises that God is going to grant Hannah's request, Jesus himself grants the Syrophoenician woman's request, which is kind of cool because in the first story, we have Eli the priest and God, but in Matthew and Mark, both of those characters are collapsed into the singular character, Jesus. Whereas Eli is basically saying that God will grant your request, Jesus simply declares it. And I believe that these intertextual allusions are on purpose, and I think there's even more evidence for that. But before I go on, I think both of these women would have been unlikely figures to play any major role in a narrative, and yet both of the narratives show that they had an enormous impact on the stories they're in. Hannah is the mother to the very prophet who leads Israel into the united monarchy under Saul and David. And the Syrophoenician woman was used by the gospel writers to demonstrate the universal scope of Jesus' ministry. In that same way, the parallel between the men has a twist. Eli, the priest, and God are collapsed into the singular character of Jesus. Now, I think that these intertextual echoes are really there, and I think it's an appealing argument in addition, because when you read in 1 Samuel 2, Hannah's prayer, there's a theme of unexpected reversals, and it includes bread as a metaphor for provision. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. In Hannah's prayer, the hungry are satisfied, which is a thematic parallel to the chiasms you see in Mark and in Matthew. The narratives beginning and ending with multiplication of bread. The universal authority also of Jesus is echoed in the ending of Hannah's prayer. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. And Jesus is the very anointed king associated with God's rule over the entirety of the earth that Hannah prophesies about, but that the Syrophoenician woman demonstrates. Because here's a Syrophoenician woman. Her people have oppressed God's covenant people in the past, and yet here she is kneeling before him, calling him Lord and Son of David. So she is demonstrating the universal scope of the exact thing Hannah prophesied about. So I really do think it's possible that Matthew and Mark make use of the Syrian woman's story as a literary parallel to Hannah to illustrate that it is actually Jesus that is the fulfillment of the same kind of thing Hannah prophesied about. Okay, so back to Jesus using the phrase, throw it to the dogs. Jesus is not insulting her based on an ethnic difference. He's bringing to mind that she comes from an enemy camp. In the bread analogy Jesus uses does not even equate with her demand. Her daughter has a demon. Jesus said bread. They weren't hungry. They needed healing. But Jesus wasn't changing the subject. In my opinion, he was using a metaphor of heavenly provision, which is dominating these chiastic structures. He already firmly established that the bread he offers has an unlimited supply by multiplying it. There's no concern that heaven's going to run out of bread for the Gentiles. Therefore, in my opinion, he's putting before the woman this enigmatic statement to test her faith. The Canaanite woman's faith is then shown to contrast as a foil with the unbelievable unbelief of the Pharisees and the scribes from Jerusalem. She's not an antagonist in this story. She's a foil. She, in her great faith, in spite of the fact that she was given a riddle or an obstacle, is a foil to the lack of faith among the religious leaders that Jesus has multiplied bread for and demonstrated miraculous power to, and yet they still don't believe. Jesus' test of words to her doesn't squish her faith, it reveals her faith. Therefore, that's why I believe that Jesus' analogy of bread in the disguise of a refusal is actually a riddle, not a rebuke. And as she solves that riddle, by claiming for herself the food that comes from the table, she's helping everyone, the reader and the listeners, understand the answer to the riddle is that Jesus is the bread of life for all people, those who are near to the covenant and those who are enemies to the covenant people. All may enter by faith. And as she solves that riddle, she explains not who she is, but who Jesus is. This bread theme in heavenly provision dominates Mark and Matthew. Even the story of Jesus walking on the water ties back to the bread motif. It says, "For they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened." That's Mark 6:52. Well, what was it that the disciples did not understand? What was Jesus demonstrating with his actions by going to Tyre or Sidon between these two feedings? Jesus is revealing that the limitless supply of heavenly bread is there for everyone, even for those who belong to enemy groups. Jesus' divine power and heavenly provision is also found in John's Gospel, but it's collapsed into just one miraculous feeding in John chapter 6. Jesus says, "I am the bread of life." And he uses both the bread multiplication miracle itself and a teaching occasion to reveal himself as the bread of life. And that's what the story of the Syrophoenician woman is about. It's not about her identity, it's about his identity. And it is in this way that she and the centurion are forerunners of the Gentiles being included into the church by faith.